Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Our next speaker says there are many ways to describe the sorry condition of Britain: falling living standards, depressed trade and investment, a health service in permanent crisis, rising crime, broken railways, and public services that have simply stopped working. Financial Times columnist Philip Stevens says the Conservatives had hoped rational Rishi Sunak would make a difference. He hasn't. Why not, we ask? And will Labour be any better at dealing with it all? Philip Stevens joins us now. Hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, great to have you with us. The last time we spoke to you was about your book Britain Alone, which looked back at Britain's decline since Suez. Our focus is a bit more on the here and now, but we will be looking at some deeper questions here too. Can we just start by talking about the sort of perilous state the Tories are in, the number of MPs who say they're going to quit in the polls, that kind of thing? Give us just a quick overview of where things stand.
Well, a quick overview is we have to have a general election by the end of January of next year. So it's going to be in the summer, the autumn, or if the Prime Minister is desperate and leaves it till the last minute, in January of next year. The Conservatives are about 20 points behind in the opinion polls. That's bad. But what's really bad is that they have been behind 20 points for the last 2 years. And it's consistent. It never moves. And whatever the government tries to do, whether it's tax cuts in the budget or as we've seen in the last few days, sort of bigging up its plans to send refugees back to, or send refugees to Rwanda, nothing shifts. The dial doesn't shift. And what you have, and if you talk to Conservative MPs, they freely admit this, is a sense that the country's made up its mind. The Conservatives, have had their time. No great enthusiasm for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, but it's time for a change. Is that most powerful, if you like, emotion in politics is here on steroids.
Okay, I sort of get that, but I suppose Rishi was meant to be something that could appeal certainly to Conservatives who believed in strong government, people who wanted a bit more order, particularly after the chaos, both of the Johnson years and particularly Liz Truss.
Yeah, I think there was a great sense of relief when Sunak took over, because particularly after frankly, the balminess of Liz Truss and the chaos of Johnson's premiership, there was a sense of, here we've got a straightforward politician. He's trustworthy. He works hard. He's got an uncomplicated personal life. And he's sort of, as most people thought, not too far to the right, not too far to the left. So he may, provide a new anchor for the Conservative Party. And in some respects, that's true. But it hasn't been enough to, if you like, change the country's opinion. And I think for two reasons. One, after 14 years and post-austerity, which was the first part of the Conservative story from 2010, 2016, 17, it's very hard to shift sentiment given the sort of sorry condition of many of our public services post-austerity. And secondly, and it's sort of, perhaps hurtful to say this, Sunak simply isn't up to the job. He's a very good technician. He's a straightforward politician. If you talk to officials who work for him, they say he's diligent, he's sharp, he's quick. But what he lacks is a world's view. And I don't mean a grand vision. I don't think all politicians have to have grand visions, but a sense of where they want the country to be, how they're going to get there, and the trade-offs that they're prepared to make along the way, and the alliances to get there. And what Sunak has, and this I'm just really citing people who work for him, is very much a sort of siloed approach to things. This week I'll deal with illegal immigration. Next week I'll deal with Northern Ireland post-Brexit. Next week we'll deal with taxation. Next week, etc. And what's missing, and one civil servant said this to me about 6 months ago, he said, I sometimes think if I ask the Prime Minister where he thinks Britain should be in 5 or 10 years' time, would he have an answer? And the answer is probably not. He's the civil servant.
That's a pretty damning one, because that's a sort of standard job interview thing, and you'd think that Rishi Sunak would be very good at job interviews.
Yeah, and what people say is that he has a set of sort of instincts and reflexes which are really quite conservative and more right wing than many had thought. So he's definitely low tax. He doesn't like welfare spending. He is genuinely quite Eurosceptic, generally quite tough on immigration. But they don't add up to a story, a narrative, which says, the Britain. I mean, Johnson, for all his chaos, had a completely unachievable sort of narrative, which was global Britain. Britain bestride the world, a second Elizabethan age, which was sort of silly. But there was something that you could see he was aiming for. Truss had an equally difficult, mad, I would say, sort of worldview of sort of Britain as sort of, as she's put it, Singapore on steroids, as it were, post-Brexit. I mean, Sunak has a sort of muddling along and, a bit more of this and this, but he doesn't, I don't think he actually knows what sort of Britain he really wants, beyond, as I say, sort of these sort of sets of particular instincts on particular things, which don't add up to a political story.
One has to bear in mind that the Conservatives have had, after Boris Johnson's electoral victory, was it 2019, a substantial majority in Parliament. So the weaknesses that they have are all in spite of that. And I'll want to come back to why that is in a moment. But I do want to produce some comparisons. France is not in a great state in terms of growth. Look at Germany, it's possibly even worse. So, our malaise, at least in economic terms, is not too dissimilar a picture to what's happening elsewhere.
It's not too dissimilar, although I think, France, if you take France, for example, it starts from a rather stronger position. It's productivity, and one of the deep underlying problem that Britain faces is problem of low productivity, low and flat productivity. Productivity in France is 20% higher per capita than in the UK. So when we laugh at the French, sort of saying, well, look, they only work 35 hours a week, that's all they need to work, relative to us, because, they need to work 4 days to produce the output that we take 5 days to make. So, and Germany, Germany's had lots of problems and still has, but it's a very, very strong underlying economy. Not so here. And we're also going through the disruption post-Brexit, where Brexit was supposed to free up trade. And that was always, I think, a false prospectus. But if you look at what's happened in the last few years, our trade is shrinking. And I'm not talking about just exports, but imports as well. We are trading less with the rest of the world. And that in turn brings its own problems, and it's a brake on growth. And so I think we have,
from an ideological perspective. Sorry, go on.
We do have problems, and well, I think we'll come back to it. But longevity is another problem for the Conservatives.
From an ideological perspective, you've got to say, okay, it's been chaotic politically. But if you are a sovereign nationalist, a Eurosceptic, Britain has left the European Union, and in constitutional terms, that's a major achievement as far as they're concerned. And the second point is, and this is sort of power light, the main focus in the political debate is on immigration, migration. Sunak has just got through a package of legislation in both houses of Parliament that will see migrants deported to Rwanda. And this is the kind of stuff that Tory backbenchers couldn't have dreamed of 15 years ago. It's a very, very different discourse.
It is a different discourse, and you're right. Of course, if you're a pure sovereigntist and you believe that the only important thing is retaining for yourself the right to make your own choices, then it's an achievement. But I think most people who voted for and argued for Brexit, argued for it as a sort of platform for a different sort of nation. as it were. And, and we can come back to this. The problem is no one really defined what sort of nation it is. And the economic costs of Brexit are visible. I mean, they may be exaggerated by some of those who want to go back in, but they are visible. The economic gains are invisible, and the irritations are very visible. So for the purists, as it were, for the theologists and their disciples, then yes, we are freer. But as for migration, I mean, it's a very curious sort of approach the government's got, because on the one hand, it says we want to limit migration. But last year, net migration into Britain was about 750,000 people, which was 3 times the level that we had, typically had in the, in the years since 2010. It's been typically running at 200,000, maybe a little bit more. So the government lets in a huge number of people over 1 year. You could say for good economic reasons. We needed these people as care workers and we wanted to fill university places. But it's rather strange then to then swing back and focus on 30, 40,000 people coming across the channel illegally. I mean, so what I'd say there is that, yes, the focus is on migration, but it's not in a consistent and in a sort of rational way, as it were. If you really care about migration, what you want to do is to say, we want much tighter restraints on legal migration, i.e. we don't want 750,000, which even for liberals is a very large number, as it were. And also, as well as obviously stopping the boats come across from France, we want to process the migrants already here. One of the problems we have with all the fuss caused by asylum seekers, we have to put them up in hotels and things, is it takes sometimes years to start looking at their applications. So there's a failure of government, as it were, in terms of the Home Office, in terms of just getting these people processed and deciding which ones have to go back and which ones can stay. So yes, those are the issues. Although I don't think migration is going to be, is a deciding question at the election. I think in some particular seats, it will help the Conservatives, but mainly not against Labour, mainly against the Reform Party, which is trying to outflank the Conservatives. This is Nigel Farage's outfit on the right. So I think Sunak has to play up immigration in order to protect his right flank. But I don't think it's going to stop votes going to Labour.
It's worth seeing those polls. I mean, we said in the beginning that the Labour had a 20% lead over the Conservatives for 2 years now. But it's also worth mentioning, as you say, the Reform Party, I think it's on about 12.3% as an average, which is ahead of the Liberal Democrats. Yeah. The pro-European Liberal Democrats are at about sort of 9.5%, which is that is significant. So in some ways, you do see that's Nigel Farage is having a big impact on electoral politics and might see some MPs elected, when the election does take place.
Well, I'm not sure whether, our first past post system is very difficult to penetrate for third parties. So I'm not sure. I think if Farage stands himself, he might have a chance, but I'm not sure about others. But where I think the reform could have a big impact is in the so-called red wall seats. These are the, if you like, seats, traditionally Labour seats that Boris Johnson won at the last election. Now, if the Reform Party takes votes away from the Conservatives in those seats, it hands them back to Labour. So if you have a discussion now with Conservative MPs, I don't know, I have not met in the last year a Conservative MP who says, I think we're going to win, or we could win the election. The question is, how badly do we lose the election? Is it going to be 1997, where Blair got 179, or can we do enough to keep it down? And that's a sort of 2-parliament victory, or can we do enough to keep it down to 30, 40, 50, as it were? I think reform does have an impact there, and that's why the government's getting very nervous about it. But again, you see the other problem, I think, with Sunak's premiership is that he sometimes seems to sort of his decisions seem to bear the imprint of the last person he's spoken to, as it were, and that if the right have been very noisy about immigration, then he will go on about immigration. But then every now and then you get the One Nation group, and there is still a group of, if you like, Shire conservatives who are more centrist. They start threatening rebellion over, for example, the European Court of Human Rights and whatever, and then Sunak, pulls back towards the centre. So he doesn't really have his. That's what I was trying to say earlier about he doesn't have his own compass, as it were.
Mm. But Sunak, we were just talking about this earlier, is really a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is that the Conservatives, the Conservative and Unionist Party, to give it its full name, doesn't really know what it is. And that's, I mean, from an outsider's point of view, if you're looking at Britain, you're thinking, what's going on? What are they doing? And I think many people here really don't understand. Why is the Conservative Party apparently so directionless? Where are they going? Why can't they work it out? And I think this takes some going into.
Yeah. Well, I think, this is a sort of battle that's been going on, I think, within the Conservative Party since the 80s, or since the toppling of Margaret Thatcher, as it were, when the Conservative turned their back on the sort of radical market-driven conservatism of Thatcher, and then with Cameron, well, first of all, went further to the right and then tacked back to the centre. And so there is this tension between the sort of always has been between the more market-orientated open conservatism and the more traditional, old Toryism, as it were, of the Shire counties. What Brexit has done, I think, is it's brought all this out into the open, because while lots of people from different sides of the party supported Brexit, it was no one really decided what Brexit meant. It meant that we could, as Johnson would have put it, shape our own destiny, make our own decisions. But what sort of Britain, the Conservative Party itself hadn't decided what sort of Britain it wanted. Did it want a Britain which was a free trade Britain, open to the world, low regulation, lower wages, driven by inward investment, etc.? This is the Liz Truss, if you like, Singapore on steroids world. Or did it want a Britain that pulled back from the world and was actually rather defensive in guarding its own sovereignty, in saying we're going to put up the walls, we're stopping free movement from Europe, and we're also going to put up barriers against immigration from the rest of the world, and we're going to be a bit more protectionist, a bit more interventionist, a bit more, putting money into industries where we want to. And that was, if you like, the red wall, the sort of red wall Brexit. This was the appeal to former Labour voters of, look, Britain, it's Britain for Britain. And that tension was never resolved, except mythically by Johnson, who wrapped it all up in this, look, we'll be great again. Global Britain will be great. We'll astride the world stage. And by the way, if anything goes wrong, it's all the fault of the elites and the institutions. And it's all the fault of the judges, the church, the media, the BBC, and with Truss, the Bank of England and the Treasury. So what we've seen is this injection of the sort of populism, which is Trumpian in many ways. It's imported from the US, but also visible across the rest of continental Europe, where parties just blame everything on a conspiracy of the old order, whatever that order. And that order in this case includes the bishops and the lefty sort of literati of Islington and Highgate and whatever, and the BBC and the Bank of England. It's a rather curious thing for because many of us brought up on the idea that conservatism was about preserving the institutions and traditions of our country. And all of a sudden you have a Conservative Party saying, we want to tear them down. You had Liz Truss the other day saying we want to abolish the Supreme Court. We want to abolish the independence of the Bank of England, and the bishop should shut up, as it were. And it's a very strange. So this is a battle that's being fought out in government, and it's really a battle that and it's one of the reasons why the Conservatives are going to lose. People realise this is a battle the party's going to have to fight out in opposition, just as Labour had to fight its battles about whether it's a far left party or a social democrat party in opposition. The Conservatives have this ideological fight going on, and you can't govern while having that fight at the same time. Otherwise, as we've seen, and Sunak has discovered, you're just at the mercy of whatever group of backbenchers decide to rebel over what at any particular time and what issue.
I'd love to get some questions from people, so please do put them down in the Q&A box. We've got some people, a few people in Australia, and also in the States as well. So please do. If you're from outside the UK and you're baffled by what's going on, Philip is the man to ask, and a great opportunity to ask him here and now. I just want to echo some of the things you've been saying. It's very funny when you hear Etonian Oxbridge MPs Jacob Rees-Mogg blaming the elites or the deep state for undermining, Brexit vision. I frequently see a friend of ours he's a very senior judge, and he talks about the elites, and I'm thinking, well, what do you do? It's a fairly absurd situation. But at the same time, I do feel that we don't know who we are anymore. I think in Blairite Britain, Thatcherite Britain, you had leaders with a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of purpose. And even with Brexit, business groups didn't weigh in to give their views very strongly about what was happening. Trade unions also fairly mute. And even now, I'm not clear about what the electorate want, other than not having the Conservatives anymore. We all seem to want our National Health Service, and that's the only policy. And the grumblings about immigration, I think, are slightly thrust upon us by the likes of Suella Braverman and the Conservatives. But we seem directionless, and are the kind of people who could provide insight also seem quite mute about it too.
Yeah, I think that's true, but in that, I don't think there isn't a party leader with a grand vision or with a new vision of Britain's future. I'm not sure that's really what the electorate wants. I think, we haven't really discussed, and where in some ways there's an inevitability about the Conservatives' defeat, which is, after 14 years, you run out of excuses. And basically, this has been 14 years where we had began with the global crash, but then we had a period of, in my view, misjudged austerity, which basically picked away at the fabric of our public services and undermined
and broke the social contract, if you like.
Broke the social contract. The government have. I think if you're looking for a villain, you could say it's George Osborne, who the Chancellor in 2010, who decided that austerity would fall 80% on spending cuts and only 20% on tax rises. So that meant the police, funding for the police, or the criminal justice system, was cut by 20% over the succeeding 5 or 6 years. And so there's this accumulation. So I think quite a lot of people are saying, we want the country to work properly. We want the police to have sufficient resources to come, when my house is, or if my house is burgled or my car stolen or my, children attacked on the street or whatever. We want to live in a country where the police have sufficient resources to do that, and the courts have sufficient resources to actually, bring charges. Or we want a country where, silly things. A good friend of mine is trying to get probate. His parent, with one of his parents died, and getting legal control of the estate it's taken 6 months and may take a year, and it should be a matter of a few weeks. So I think
and
a
in the
lot of
meantime,
people,
he has to pay the taxes on the estate beforehand, before he's actually got control. So he has to come up with the money before he's got any extra money.
Yeah. So
A question. Sorry, go on.
So a lot of it is about making Britain work again, and so I'm not sure whether there is an appetite for among most voters for a sort of, here's a solution. If we do this, I think we've had enough of that. Brexit was supposed to be that. But,
yeah. Oh, we've got a question, I think, from the Netherlands. Rick van Wilden. Go ahead, Rick. You need to open your microphone, Rick. There you go.
I'm actually, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicholas. I'm actually in London, but it's correct that I'm Dutch. In listening to you and obviously reading the press over the preceding months, one of the thoughts that has been keeping me busy is to what extent the Tories could actually lose so phenomenally that they won't recover and they won't be able to resolve their ideological battle, and it may lead to realignment of the political landscape, with part of the Tories breaking away and joining Reform UK. How likely do you think that may be?
I think it's possible. Particularly, I mean, you're talking about the, as happened in Canada a couple of decades ago, where the centre-right party was wiped out in an election, and then you had a realignment. I think it's possible. I certainly would not be surprised if Labour Starmer got, a majority, at least the level of Blair's in 97, so that's 179. I think it's possible, and I mean the problem for the sort of realignment question, which we've had, off and on in British politics for the last sort of 4 decades, and of course in the early 1980s, is whether there could be a realignment on the left, and we had, a new party, Social Democratic Party, which looked for a while as if it might force it. Our electoral system is merciless towards smaller parties in terms of getting seats. So, as I said earlier, while it may be that Reform does extremely well in terms of getting, as many vote share as big as the Liberals, it's very hard for them to get seats. I think that's the problem for a more general realignment of the right here. If you have, but I think it's I think more likely you'd have another period as we had, with Blair, where the Conservatives are out of office at least for 2 terms and maybe even for 3. And then during that period, they reset. Now, where they'll end up after that period, I don't know. But I mean, whereas I sort of sympathize a bit with you, because there is a strain in the present Conservative Party, what I would call the English nationalist strain, which seems to value its ideology much more than power. I mean, the Conservative Party traditionally has been known as the stupid party, but that's really been a compliment. It's not stupid in that it's unintelligent, but stupid in the sense that its focus has been on adopting policies that keep it in power. With the present generation of Conservatives at Westminster, it's that a lot of that has gone, and you have people who care much more for guarding defending their opinions than holding on to power. Some of them, you feel that they don't really want to be ministers. They much prefer the sort of soapbox, and perhaps this is the world with social media and like personality politics we're in. So I think it's a realignment is plausible, a realignment on the right, but I wouldn't have it as my sort of central forecast.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another question in just a second. We've got another one from Jean Hunter in a moment. I do want to turn to the Labour government. I was driving through Birmingham recently, not far from here, and the adverts there for Labour candidates have got the Union flag up behind them. So, you know, a good sort of nationalist Labour pitch there. But it would seem to me that the party appears to constrain itself on most fronts. It won't it says it won't do anything to anger the city. It won't move anywhere on Brexit. Brexit is just not an issue you want to get into whatsoever. It won't do a deal on movement of Labour with the European Union. Certainly won't criticise Israel or get anything close to criticising what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So what are the challenges that it faces, but also what are the constraints that it's set up for itself?
Well, as a citizen, I feel deeply disappointed that Labour isn't laying out, setting out its ambitions and its aspirations much more clearly. As a political commentator, I think they're doing precisely the right thing. I mean, if you're the opposition and the conversation running up to an election is mainly about the performance of the government, the splits in the Conservative Party, the behaviour of individual Conservative MPs, the fact that scores of Conservative MPs are, basically resigning in advance of the election by saying they won't refight their seat. Why, if you're the opposition, would you want to change that conversation into one about, what would they do? So the election really is going to be about, the Labour Party trying to keep the conversation on the government's record and performance, and the Conservative Party, as we hear week in, week out, trying desperately to change it and saying, yes, but what would they do? They would mess it up even more. But I think it's, I'm not, the Union Jack and the fiscal caution is nothing new. If you go back to the 1990s, Blair and Brown between them were absolutely adamant that in their first term that they would stick to Conservative spending plans, and they did actually, and foolishly so. I remember Kenneth Clarke, who would have been Tory Chancellor had the Conservatives won, saying, I wrote down all these numbers. I would never have kept to them if I had been re-elected, but Labour did. So I don't think it's surprising that they're being cautious. I think, there is an element of, as one Labour MP said to me, it's sort of Blairism without the inspiration. There is a sense it would be nice to be, sort of picked up and by Keir Starmer and team. But I think also, there's a warning in this, which is, the public finances in this country are they're not in absolutely terrible shape, but they're not in great shape. We have, as I said earlier, a real problem with productivity. We have a big deficit in terms of investment in the fabric of our country. And I'm not talking about, just sort of day-to-day public services, but in terms of, the railways, the roads, the school buildings, hospital buildings, etc. And it's going to be very difficult for any new government to match, to say, well, we're not going to, and the level of taxation is historically quite high. So it's quite, there's a very limited amount of space for the opposition. I think Starmer's strategy is to say and I think my own view is that governments can make a difference with relatively limited resources if they set directions. So if Labour gets elected and says, look, we're not going to do all these things now, but here are 3 or 4 things where we're really going to make a difference. If it does that, then I think they can be successful. But don't expect them to say very much more before the election. And as I say, as a citizen, I want to hear a lot more. But as a commentator, they're doing exactly as I would do in their position.
Let's take another question. We've got Jean Hunter with us, a more fundamental question. Go ahead, Jean.
Hi, I'm from the northwest of Lancashire. So I'm really concerned about the significant levels of disillusionment among voters generally. They've lost confidence in politicians, they've lost confidence in democracy. And I don't really see any evidence that the current political parties have the ability to rebuild that either in the short or long term. And it has the potential to have quite an impact on the election as well. So I just wondered what Philip's views were on that and what can be done.
I think, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the, this isn't a party political point, but one of the unforgivable things that some Conservatives have done in the past few years is to sort of really to trash politics, to suggest that nothing can be done, that that it's all that whatever is tried, it will be obstructed by these so-called elites, as it were, and that has, I think, contributed to this sense of they're all the same and they're all out in it together. My own experience of incidentally of over many years of knowing MPs across the parties is that isn't the case. Most MPs genuinely want to change things for the better, but I think you're absolutely right that it'll be very hard to restore faith in politics. I think a government, again, of whatever political colour, a government that basically tries to do the right thing in an honest and open way will, over a long period of time, begin to win back trust. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think the loudness and the coarsening of politics over the last few years, I think you're right, will take a lot to pull back. My own answer to this is that whoever wins or is in power, is we need more and more devolution. I mean, devolution to local government, to mayors, to local communities, because if you like, that's the way to restore faith in politics, to give people on the ground the capacity to change their own lives, rather than assume that the person in Whitehall always knows best. But yeah, I think you point up a very serious danger that not just Britain but all countries, all Western democracies face. And the other thing is, and part of this is also, what you might call contested truth. Or the alternative facts that people now present. It used to be that whatever differing views that politicians had, they played on the same playing field. There were certain things that were agreed as to be true and factual. Now, the answer is, and I see it, ministers go on television regularly and just say things that are untrue. And they assume that if they say them often enough, then the untruthfulness will, get overlooked. And I think that's very dangerous. So I think restoring integrity to government is, again, for the next government, is going to be one of its most important tasks.
With that in mind, let's take a question from across the pond. Marty Ryan has got a question. Go ahead, Marty.
This sounds so suspiciously like what's happening here in the U.S. And so I'm just really curious about your perspective on what impact has the U.S. had on politics in Britain, or is this just a more global issue?
I think that's very good. I think I think some of the pressures, the underlying forces here of working class populations in democracies who face stagnating incomes for decades in the case of the US and the UK. Some of those issues are common across, but I think stylistically, I think the sort of populist conservatives, as I would call them, whether it's Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, have taken their cue from the pro-Trump Republicans in the United States. And I think there are, I was saying earlier about, this playing fast and loose with the truth. And I think, some of that has been imported from Donald Trump, frankly, and this and the sense of, just as we were saying, it's odd to hear old Etonians, talking about the elites when they are part of them. People have here, I think, or some people have seen here that, well, Trump got away with it. I mean, Trump, a billionaire American New York real estate guy, saying that he's, on the side of the small man and woman. So I think, stylistically, a lot of it's been imported, but I think the general populist trend, and I think it's one of the things you have to say about the populists, although they don't have solutions, they are identifying in many cases genuine grievances among communities, and so I think a chunk of the Conservative Party has certainly imported the MAGA style of politics from the US.
I like the muggers to the MAGA. You've been mugged. I look at the differences between Britain. We travel a lot, and increasingly, I think our own people and the place we live in looks poorer. I think it's you could, for those who don't know, possibly we could talk about what's happened with our water network recently and how that's been managed in terms of ownership and where the money has all gone. But Philip, I want to know if you're liberal or not a massive Eurosceptic, where does the hope lie? And then also, where does the hope lie in terms of productivity? How do you manage to, get wealthier again so that you can afford to pay for all these things, National Health Service included?
Right. Well, here we've got to snap out of it because we've been talking about all the problems we've faced. But actually, and I'm sure you agree with me, I think Britain is a great country. And I can look around and I can see enormous strengths. I look at our universities, look at our scientists, look at, the skill of, even our media is actually, pretty good. Look around and there is, by and large, it's full of decent people, full of enterprising people, people who want to get on and make a success for their families, but also of their communities and whatever. So I think there is a danger of sort of falling into this sort of bogland of it's nothing can be done. I think things can be done. We have great strengths. We have, someone was telling me the other day about our advanced automotive engineering skills. We're not very good at making cars, but apparently we're among the best of the world in terms of performance engineering, engineering for performance cars. So it seems to me that it is just like hard work and it's, and calmness. And I think government will be better. Again, a civil servant said to me, who's had, he said in the last 13 years, I think he said he'd had about 8 secretaries of state. He said, my department will work 2 or 3 times better if we just keep secretaries of state for 3 or 4 years. But having someone come in every year or 2 and just change everything. So I think, slowly we can fix government slowly, but I think you start with setting directions in 1 or 2 or 3 key areas. If I was Keir Starmer, I'd say I'm going to start building houses. I'm going to let councils build social housing in a big way.
Has he not? I'm surprised by that. That's good. I thought the Conservatives said they would.
He's given very cautious targets, but I would be Macmillanite, the Conservative, Prime Minister in the 1950s, who said we're going to build 1 million houses. We're going to do it. That's it, and then insist that we do it. So I think you can set areas where you're going to make a visible difference. But it is going to be a long haul. But again, we have a beautiful country, so And we are still, I don't know, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th richest country in the world. So it can't all be bad. That's my
depending on the day of the week and the value of the pound. If you've got any more questions, people, please do just add another one in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we will wrap up fairly soon. I mean, so just you talked about housing, but are any other possibilities that, once Labour's in government, if it's got a huge majority, it's got the potential to do things. And so, what else would you? Housing is one thing. Where else would you look at?
Well, housing is very much a domestic one. I think I think the NHS is going to force itself on us. I think Labour have got in this chap called Wes Streeting, who I regard as probably the next Labour leader, one of their smartest people, who I think will try to do things in the NHS which aren't just about throwing money at it, but about modernizing it and changing it and introducing technology. I mean, both of my children work in the NHS, and they see the potential for technology to transform many of the mundane things that have to be done in hospitals and whatever. Reading, analyzing X-rays and things which can be done by computer a lot more efficiently and effectively. So I think. Yeah, of course, we haven't talked about abroad, and the task of the next government is going to have to be to rebuild the relationship with Europe. And I think there, in my view, there are some easy wins, as it were. Theresa May, for example, as part of Brexit, suggested that we have a political and foreign policy and defence association with the EU. Not membership, but just that we turn up at all their meetings in the same way as we turn up at NATO meetings, and we cooperate, and perhaps we join their defence industrial planning. I think that is doable, and I think that would make our position in Europe much more comfortable. The threat from Putin isn't going to go away. I mean, we've got the Prime Minister today is meeting Chancellor Scholz in Germany, but one of the effects of Brexit is that our ministers and Prime Minister see European leaders far less frequently now. So the sort of political foreign policy defence association agreement with the EU, which I think a Labour government can do, and it doesn't offend, it only offends the most extreme sovereigntists, as it were. This isn't about handing over sovereignty. It's about being in NATO or being in the IMF or whatever. So I think that there's scope there. I think there is scope in terms of the tilt in public spending. I think where Labour has left itself a bit of room is we are underinvested. One of the sort of tragedies of Treasury austerity, and what I was saying earlier about Osborne insisting that 80% fell on public spending, is that the Treasury slashed spending on investment in all sorts of things. And I think the room that Labour's left itself in its own fiscal rules is to say, we're going to be very, very tough on current spending. That's the day-to-day spending, but we are going to borrow more in order to invest because we get a return on that. So I think public investment, I think we can see rising, and I think some of that public investment will obviously be, a lot of it, I think, will obviously be in green technologies. Again, talking about where can we achieve things? We have achieved some things in terms of our transition to clean energy has been really quite strong. That can be accelerated. So I think I wouldn't call it an industrial strategy, but I think a more smarter support for various industrial sectors could be part of the story. I think in the end, education, I think one of the achievements of the Blair period was to transform education in London. With its, if you look at the quality of education in London, the beginning and end of the sort of Blair terms, it transformed. But it was never pushed out from London. I mean, I would be spending money in towns in the Midlands. I mean, not just in the cities, in the towns, to try and really lever up education or standards there. And I think you can justify spending money on that. But I think, I think Starmer will have more, if he, as I expect him to do, wins a very large majority, he'll have more, he'll be able to, I think, be able to keep most of his promises and have more room than we perhaps imagine now to make changes.
Stephen, it's been a really good overview of all things British and a bit of abroad as well. Before you go, I want you to say what you're working on right now, because we've got a tour coming up to Ireland that considers a question that you're looking at.
Well, I have just, or I'm just about to hand to my publisher a manuscript of a book on Anglo-Irish relations since partition, so since 1921. Which tries to explores the relationship and tries to look at it from both sides rather than just one side, and then tries to draw out from this lessons that should be learned when we think about where Ireland is going to go in the next 10, 15, 20 or 30 years, whether a united Ireland is feasible, what a united Ireland should actually look like, because it won't, in my view, just be a question of bolting on Northern Ireland to the existing republic. If there is a united Ireland, it will have to be a reinvented Ireland as well. And so So what I hope is that we will learn some of the lessons, and two lessons stand out. Things go badly when the British neglect Ireland. And we saw that most recently over Brexit, which Brexit had huge repercussions for Ireland. But before Brexit, no one paid any attention whatsoever. And things go badly when the two governments don't work together. When you have governments in Dublin and London pushing in opposite directions, it doesn't work for either side. So this won't be out until, given that book publishing takes a long time, this won't be out till early next year or spring of next year. But that's good, because that'll be after the next Irish election. And Ireland has an election, again, rather like the British, it's got to happen by about February of next year. And then we may...
And we could see a Sinn Féin administration, at least the polls indicate that.
Large part. Yeah, whether we'll see a Sinn Féin administration, I'm more sceptical in the south, but anyway. So it's a great subject. It's one of these, like Europe, Ireland's been a neuralgic issue for the British.
And an issue is sort of tend to ignore a lot of the time as well, or push away and not want to think about. Listen, it's been very good. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you very much for your time, Philip.